Hello Internet, Taliesin here, and today we are talking Azerite. It's glowing, it's blue, and a bit yellow. It's the source of all your Battle for Azeroth endgame power progression, and to be totally honest, it's absolutely the last thing I want to be talking about right now at this stage of the expansion. What I want to be talking about today is all the cool new lore surrounding the upcoming 8.1, or speculation about what Ian might have in store for us at BlizzCon. Actually, you know what I could really get my teeth into right now? Is a new juicy cinematic to analyze. That would be a great video. I'd love to make that video, so yeah, Terran, if your guys do have a sneaky, unexpected cutscene up your sleeve, you'd be doing all of us a massive solid by dropping it in like the next 6 seconds so we don't have to talk about Azerite. Okay, no, fine, whatever. Azerite it is, because Azerite, the heart of Azeroth, and Azerite Armor is supposed to form the core of power progression in Battle for Azeroth. It's the pillar around which all max level gearing is built, and it's probably the single most important mechanic that the expansion has to get right. There's a pretty strong case right now that says not only have Blizzard not got it right, but they've managed to make such a mess of it that it's threatening the life and legacy of the entire expansion, which is obviously a problem. When I think BfA, I'd much rather think stunning capitals, excellent storytelling, a top-notch opening raid, and the dependable joys of Mythic plus fun times than a shitfest of developers scrambling to patch the leaks in a core mechanic that a sizable amount of the player base would rather see thrown out entirely at this stage. But this is where we are. So in this Taliessay, yeah, sorry guys, but I'm convinced I can make that name stick as long as I just keep saying it. We are going to look in depth at Azerite Armor. What is it supposed to do? What is going wrong? What is going right? And yes, how can Blizzard fix it? Because, okay, spoiler warning for the end of the video here, but although the problems with the Azerite Armor system are many and well documented, and we will be looking at as many of them as I can think of today, I'm also convinced that the entire thing could be put back on track with a couple of very simple changes that stay true to the original intention and goal of the system without the need to burn the entire thing down and pretending it never happened like Highlander 2. And yes, basically what I'm saying is, I'm about to fix the heart of Azeroth. So join us as we get to the bottom of the Azerite debacle in Battle for Azeroth, okay? Go, 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 go. Before we dive headfirst into everything wrong with the current system, I think it's important to have a quick reminder of where the system comes from and what it is supposed to do, because that's going to give us a proper context for its failings later on. So the origins of Azerite Armor in BfA can be found in the artifact weapon system of all round. Everyone loved it apart from some people, but to be honest, even lots of them say they quite liked it now too. General favourite expansion of the modern era, Legion. As an expansion, Legion had a big time focus on classes. Classes were like its big thing. There was a massive redesign of classes for the game, which saw some specs change beyond recognition. We got a whole new class added in Demon Hunters, class halls, order hall campaigns, and class mounts focused on you, the player, really identifying with your chosen spec. And the cherry on top of all of this was the artifact weapon, a legendary, iconic symbol of your class identity with massive lore significance, which was ceremonially bestowed upon your character at the very start and which you carried with you for the lifetime of the expansion. So yes, the downside was you wouldn't be getting any weapon drops in Legion. The good news was it didn't really matter because you had the Ashbringer or the Doom Hammer or a keg of beer on a stick, but it was awesome, okay? And it wasn't just a cool thing to carry around, or in the case of Shadow Priest, go on dates with, because the artifact weapon was also a new max level progression system too. Here, for the first time in the game, was a perpetual leveling system beyond simply replacing all your current gear with more powerful gear every time a new raid hit. New levels on your artifact were unlocked using artifact power, giving you new traits and stronger abilities. And the great thing about that was it never stopped. And also the bad thing about that was it never stopped. The artifact power you needed to level your weapon was rewarded from multiple and varied sources. So in theory, every time you played the game, and however you chose to play the game, anything you did would give you progression on your artifact for a warm sense of pride and accomplishment. Thank you, artifact power. In practice, of course, players found that the most efficient way to farm the stuff wasn't in fact to play the game however you like, but instead run more of souls until their eyes started to bleed, and that's what they did. You see, the problem with never-ending progression systems is that there is nothing to stop the most serious players doing themselves a serious damage, progressing as far into it as humanly possible to get that all-important edge over other players. The 35 traits unlock that was intended to be the overall finish line for players in patch 8.0 instead became the minimum requirement to even enter the opening raid, something Blizzard hadn't really accounted for, unbelievably, and one of the reasons Emerald Nightmare was over quicker than the entire Dark Universe franchise. There was also never much of an element element of choice to gearing your artifact. There were traits to unlock, and you unlocked them, simple as that. And eventually, new levels stopped awarding new traits and abilities altogether, instead just giving a flat damage buff, and that was okay. Artifact weapons were genuinely cool. Getting new skins for them was cool. Ending the expansion with a ridiculous amount of buffs, abilities, and other effects all tied to this weapon you'd leveled from the start felt really cool. And all of this was enough to create a system which, although obviously not perfect, just about did the job it was supposed to, and the basic idea was clearly something that Blizzard were going to keep and iterate on going into Battle for Azeroth. Obviously, we couldn't do the whole weapon thing again, although I maintain we could have if we'd gone with my awesome forging your own weapon idea, but anyway. And Blizzard's replacement for the weapon this expansion is the Heart of Azeroth, a necklace that you empower in the same way as your artifact, but rather than unlocking new traits on the neck piece itself, levels you gain on the Heart of Azeroth instead unlock traits on Azerite Armor pieces that fill the head, shoulder, and chest slots. Gear that is replaced just like any other gear throughout the expansion, but all with different combinations of traits to enhance your character in different ways. And yes, I know what you're thinking, and you're right, that is already a lot more complicated than artifact weapons. Instead of streamlining and refining the system, like the story of garrisons to order halls to pretty unimportant mission tables on a boat somewhere, why have we gone completely the other direction with Azerite? Well, there were certain problems that Azerite Armor was designed to solve, and let's look at those. In an ideal world, what should Azerite be achieving right now? Because the thing is, there is so much about the Heart of Azeroth and Azerite Armor that I like in theory. So in theory, what are the exact functions, the exact roles that this system is supposed to fill? Well, there's the spec lock problem. The fact that you had to level a different weapon from scratch for each specialization that you wanted to play was, on the face of it, not exactly alt-friendly in Legion. The Heart of Azeroth is always at the same level whatever spec you play, allowing you to change roles a lot more easily. And yes, I know what you're thinking, but the problems and why that might not actually end up being the case comes later, but in theory, problem solved. Gear targeting was also an oft-repeated goal. Legion drew big criticism for its reliance on RNG in its gear acquisition. Legendary items were incredibly important to maximizing your play, but were impossible to actually aim for, and often made receiving one an exercise in disappointment that you missed out on your BIS again, rather than just happy because you got something really cool. Artifact relics had completely random traits, which made them pretty much the most unsatisfying loot drop ever. Honestly, once I had a couple that I liked in my main weapon, I stopped even checking new ones I looted because I could not be bothered. The whole system was so convoluted and boring to me, I just enjoyed the game more by totally ignoring it. So that's not good. The fact that I know in advance exactly what pieces I need and where they drop from means that I can target the ones I want just like other loot. In theory, problem solved. Oh yeah, and don't forget, Azerite Armor is free of all that Titan forging stuff that meant that you would keep farming a certain piece of gear even when you've already got it, in the hope that you'll win the Titan Forge lottery and get it again, but better. So problem solved times 2 on that one, I guess. Problem solved squared or something. Choice, something that didn't exist on artifact weapons after about the first month or so. You just unlocked every trait on there. There was no decision to make. Whereas obviously with Azerite Armor, you can replace any piece with another carrying different traits whenever you want. So you have choices to make, not just in the gear you choose, but also in the specific traits you choose to unlock that gear. At the high end, it should be as exciting to get a coveted piece of Azerite gear as it should be to loot your 2nd or 4th tier set piece or a good trinket, except better because it's like having 3 set bonuses instead of just 2. Again, in theory, problem solved. Progression, rather than the laser-targeted Legion situation of Shane running a Mythic Plus because you had to get all of your traits unlocked before the raid opened, Blizzard want Azerite to be a much more natural thing to collect. So as well as being able to get it from all of the same sources as you could in Legion, quests, world quests, follower missions, dungeons, Mythic Plus and raids, there are now 2 other sources in Warfronts and Island Expeditions, the latter of which was specifically designed to be the most efficient way to get an initial weekly dump of artifact power. Also, the amount of artifact power you need is directly linked to the item level of your gear, so you can have all of the traits unlocked on lower level gear, but still have a desire to be gaining artifact power because you'll need more as your gear improves. In theory, more varied ways to farm artifact power and less punishment for not having the maximum level gained, problem solved. So wow, Azerite Armor is a great idea, right? I mean, look at all of these ways that it improves on artifact weapons. Look at all the problems that it solves. Surely this system is just flat out objectively better than Legion. GG Blizz, see you next episode. Well, no. Obviously, this video is called The Problem with Azerite, not the much-winning fun-time blowjobs and strawberry awesomeness of Azerite, because clearly these things haven't all happened, and clearly there are other problems that have cropped up along the way. But I think it's good to have this list as a reference point, because this is what Blizzard wanted to achieve in BfA, and when it comes to fixing the system, any ideas that can keep those intentions are going to be more useful than just inventing a whole other system. So with that said, what went wrong? At this point, the most famous collection of perceived problems that the Azerite Armor system faces is this list drawn up on the forum post by Chaosbug, which, to be honest, we could probably just work our way down point by point, but if you don't mind, I'm going to take these in a slightly different order for reasons of structure and flow. So, major problem number 1, the traits. Azerite Armor is all about the traits, the actual changes that these pieces of gear bestow upon your character and their abilities, and frankly, there's a couple of things which at the moment are problematic about them. 1, they're boring. Not all of them, granted, just like not all of the characters in Iron Fist are super annoying, just the vast majority of them. Generally, this first round of traits are mostly passive and overall pretty dull. Flat damage increases of certain abilities aren't really going to capture anyone's imagination, and really failed to win the player base over to the system from the start. Because why would you make a system where the main selling point is the cool effects that the armor will give you, and then fail to give people really cool effects? Well, there's probably an answer to that actually, and honestly, probably it's because this is still 8.0, and it's possible that the designers thought it made sense to start with the smallest scale, most straightforward, and least exciting traits at the beginning of the expansion, and in theory at least, I agree with them. If I were a dev, in theory, I'd want the traits to get more interesting and gameplay changing as the expansion progressed. Like if I had a trait which was X ability does more damage, and one which was use this to reset all of your cooldowns, guess which one I'm putting in the first batch of traits, and guess which one I'm saving for a bit further down the line. I mean, look at what Azerite traits are replacing this tier. 35 levels of artifact upgrades, the vast majority of which people forget were pretty boring stat padding themselves, and raid tier set bonuses, which Emerald Nightmare drops didn't even have. I want the traits that come out in 8.1 to be more interesting and fun than the traits that we have now, and I want the traits that come out in 8.2 to be even more awesome again, because I don't want to be aiming to get the exact same traits on gear in the last raided expansion that I was in the first. Starting small and basic makes it easier to achieve that effect, so I can see the thinking behind it. But that doesn't mean it feels good to have a load of boring traits on offer now, and the effect it has is to kill player enthusiasm for the system right off the bat. This is an easy one to fix though, you'd have thought, right? Seriously, just make more interesting traits, innit? But being dull isn't the only problem traits have. They are also vague, unintuitive, and indistinct, which means it's really difficult to tell from the tooltip most of the time whether a trait is actually any good or not. In an ideal world, it should be obvious straight off the bat what a trait does and what situations it would be best in, rather than having to look at sims of every single trait because they're all so similar in their basicness that you would have no other way of knowing. Like, imagine 2 new James Bond movies came out at the same time, and one of them starred Idris Elba and the other starred Jaden Smith. You're going to want to know which is which before you decide which one to see, and if the cast lists are secret, that's not really going to help. And the refarming problem is also connected to this. If you have a piece of Azerite gear with a certain trait unlocked on it, and then you get a higher eye level piece with the same trait on it, and it's quite possible that your Heart of Azeroth won't be advanced enough to unlock that trait straight away, and you find yourself in a situation where you're farming AP specifically to unlock a trait that you already had access to on your previous piece of gear. And yes, it has a higher item level, and the numbers may reflect that, but it still doesn't feel very fun or satisfying to be doing that a lot of the time. It feels a bit like when you die in a game and your last save point was way back at the beginning of the level. It feels like you're playing catch up, which is kind of the opposite of how new gear should make you feel. And then there's reforging costs. This is an especially controversial point, and probably the single most divisive thing that we'll talk about in the video. Once you choose a trait and you get the cool graphic effects, it's essentially locked in, and the only way to change it is to reforge in Borealis or Dazara lore for a rising cost that will quickly get into the thousands. The reason it's so cumbersome and expensive to reforge Azerite armor is because Blizz don't want you to do it, and in principle, they are totally right. Reforging for every little thing sucks. I don't want to be doing it every time I switch specs or go from raid to dungeon loadout, and neither do you, so thank you, Blizz, for doing everything in your power to discourage us from doing that and making it an unviable way to play. The problem is that there's no real alternative. Yes, I'm used to swapping out all my gear if I change to a tank spec or PvP or whatever, but high-level Azerite armor is generally harder to get hold of than other slots, so a lot of the time you're using pieces with traits which are just wrong for the spec you're playing with, which is not ideal. So reforging being difficult and expensive may be what people are upset about, but it isn't the problem here. The problem is actually that you want to reforge your gear all the time. And when we get to fixing it in the next part of the video, we really want to avoid that fix being make reforging easier, if at all possible. That would be curing a symptom and not the cause. Azerite armor acquisition. This was the first in the list of complaints in the forum post, but I've left it till last here because I believe it's at the very heart of nearly all of the other problems that Azerite armor has. Basically, Azerite armor doesn't drop from Mythic Plus except in your weekly chest, and even then, it only has the same chance to drop as everything else, which makes Mythic Plus basically the worst possible way to farm Azerite armor, which upsets people because they've become become used to that being one of the main ways that they gear up. Now, Chaos Bug's post goes into great detail on the probability of getting the piece you want from your weekly cache, but I would argue that this is, again, a symptom rather than a problem in of itself. And I know this is going to clash with a lot of people, because the popular opinion is that good Azerite gear is just too hard to come by, and having it easier to farm from Mythic Plus would be a really big help. But I honestly don't think that would solve anything at all, as I will explain to you now, because I am about to fix Azerite Armor. So looking at all of these problems above, it's clear that not only is Azerite Armor a bit of a mess, but more importantly, it is not solving the problems that it was supposed to, that we identified at the beginning. It doesn't allow you to swap specs easier because you need multiple different sets of armor, which are too hard to come by. The reforging issue is a symptom of this, because with multiple sets being an unrealistic goal for most players, reforging becomes their only option. Also linked to that, players feel like they are still at the mercy of the RNG gods because they're waiting to hit the jackpot in the weekly Mythic Plus cache. The feeling of choice isn't there because the traits generally aren't distinct enough to make them feel like they have specific uses, so all you end up doing is looking at the sims for the best trait for your class and then just aiming to get gear with that one on and screw anything else. And the feeling of progression isn't there either, because too often you feel like you're working to unlock the same trait that you already had unlocked on your previous lower eye level piece in that slot. And of course the reason that happens so often is because of the problem described above. It's because there's only one or two traits that you're interested in the first place. And looking at all these things, it's clear to see for me that although there is a long list of complaints, they all stem from the same one or two problems. And this is why I am not on the scrap the entire thing start again side of how to fix Azerite Armor. That's why I don't agree with, say, Belialar's idea about only having traits on the heart of Azeroth itself and have them interchangeable like glyphs. Even though that's a good idea for a progression system generally, and I wouldn't be surprised to see Blizz use something like it in a completely different expansion, implementing that is actually a lot more effort and upheaval than just fixing what's here, because when all of your problems are born of one or two core issues, it only takes one or two changes to fix all of those problems. But before I get onto any ideas I have to fix it, what are Blizzard themselves doing? Well, they did some firefighting on the existing traits by essentially bringing them all much more into line with each other power-wise than they were before, with a promise to introduce better, more engaging traits in the future. They did some fire fanning with Law's blue post last week, which had the same calming effect as putting on your best meat suit and kicking a starving Rottweiler in the balls. And as we were editing this very video, a new blue post from Law detailing some more detailed plans. Oh, I should have proofread that bit. A repeat of the promise to introduce more engaging stats. Also a plan to have Azerite Armor awarded from emissaries be able to scale up to eye level 370, and most dramatically of all, an extra ring of traits added to top tier Azerite Armor to give you more chance of getting the trait you want on any given gear. Now, instead of talking about these proposals now, I'm going to go ahead and say what I would do and why I would do, and come back to these at the end and see if you can guess what I think of Blizzard's fixes here and how effective I think they'll be by what I say in the next bit. It's like a game that you can win, and I know you love games that you can win. So with all of that being said, it's time to get on to probably the main point of this entire video. If I'm so clever, how would I fix all of this? Well, I will tell you. The philosophy that I would approach this entire situation from can be summed up as make Azerite Armor more like tier sets. Let me explain. At the moment, the two major issues we have are acquisition and gear swapping. Gear swapping is hard because the gear you want is hard to come by because it's almost impossible to farm Azerite gear from Mythic Plus. So the obvious solution that a lot of people put forward is make it easier to farm Azerite from Mythic Plus. But I disagree. I say make it more like tier sets. In Legion, your 2 and 4 piece set bonus changed automatically depending what spec you were in. You didn't need to get enough armor for your Fury set bonus and then go and farm it all up again for your protection bonus, because as we've seen from Azerite Armor, that sucks. So I say get rid of the element of choice from the outer ring completely, because let's face it, there's only a pretend element of choice as it is. There's only one trait you're ever going to pick. Why not lose the neutral trait altogether and make the outer ring one trait for each spec, which changes automatically depending on what spec you're in, like tier sets. You can still have the cool trait changing graphic, which is really cool in fairness. You are still choosing the inner 2 rings, and yes, some of those are spec specific too. So at the absolute cutting edge, having a different set for every occasion is still going to be slightly more effective, but not massively so like it is now. At a stroke, this solves the reforging problem in a way that Blizzard wants, but it also solves the acquisition problem, because suddenly you don't need to make it easier to farm Azerite Armor in Mythic Plus anymore. Whoa, okay, back up. Right, I hear you. I can feel your anger and your rage from here, but just stop typing in the comments about how wrong I am just for a second and hear me out here, okay? Because this is the most important bit. Yes, I'm saying it's right and preferable that Mythic Plus is a useless way to farm Azerite Armor, and here's why. Make it more like tier sets. You couldn't farm tier sets from Mythic Plus in Legion at all, and nobody thought that was a terrible broken system. But why? Well, Mythic Plus has completely revolutionized revolutionized the way our characters gear up. It's absolutely the best way to farm almost every gear slot apart from Azerite Armor, and that's clearly how Blizzard have planned it. They're super cool with the Mythic Plus loot carousel because it's a really fun way to play the game, but they want the absolute most prestigious gear, the top tier, most desirable stuff, which is what they identify Azerite Armor as being, as coming from raids, at least for PvE gear. That's the exact way they approached it in Legion, and that's great. It gives you a reason to progress in those two different parts of the game. So why isn't it working now? Well, the problem with Azerite Armor in Mythic Plus is not that it's impossible to farm, it's that for what feels like the majority of specs, their best in slot Azerite pieces are only available in dungeons. So the problem is not that Mythic Plus is a rubbish way to farm that Azerite gear. People feel bad about how hard that is only because they need to farm it to get their best pieces. And this is simple bad design from Blizzard, but not in the way that most people think. Because what happens if you make it more like tier sets? What happens if there are traits which are clearly the best traits, but the Azerite Armor pieces that have those traits are only available in raid? Suddenly players aren't upset that it's impossible to farm Azerite gear from Mythic Plus because they don't need to get their BIS. They run more reliable raids for it, which is a dynamic we're all used to and fine with. Mythic Plus remains the best way to just flat out farm most gear, but raid is still where you go for those most interesting pieces. I even kind of think that this is how Blizzard have planned the system themselves, but their first round of traits were so samey and boring that even they didn't know which ones were the best, which is why we've ended up in this situation where everyone's BIS pieces are in dungeons, which is stupid. By the way, this change would also solve the problem of re-unlocking the exact same trait on new gear that you were just using on your old gear. If the only place you can get the best Azerite traits is raid, and when you get your shiny new raid gear with its BIS trait, there's no way that you already had that trait on the gear that you're replacing, because you can only get it here. Needing to unlock a new ring doesn't feel anywhere near as bad if your reward is a totally new trait, which is better than the one you've just given up. It's when it's the same trait that it feels horrible. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you're angry and I must be wrong, even if you can't quite put your finger on why. Well, let me help you out, because I know why. You know that even though what I'm describing is the exact way Mythic Plus gear and raid gear was balanced in Legion and everyone liked that, there is a difference. And you're right, because although you couldn't farm tier pieces from Mythic Plus, that didn't mean that you couldn't still get good gear in those slots. You could still get high item level chests and helms and shoulders. They had no cool effects on them, but you weren't left with nothing in those slots if you weren't raiding. The way things are now, someone running only Mythic Plus for their gear is likely to get stuck with Azerite Armor, which is much lower item level than everything else they're wearing, which is dumb. And that's when you start getting angry about Mythic Plus not dropping enough Azerite gear. So you see, Taliesin, we have to make Azerite more plentiful in Mythic Plus, you numbnut. Well, no, not if we make it more like tier sets. As in, just introduce helms, shoulders, and chests into dungeon loot tables that aren't Azerite gear. They can drop from the chest at the end of a run, just like normal gear. They can warforge up, just like normal gear. Although you might want to cap it at that. Someone can then happily gear up exclusively in Mythic Plus and have the high eye level to show for it, but the gear they have in those 3 slots, and only those 3 slots, is never going to be as great as what they could get in raid, exactly like in Legion. Except in Legion it was 4 slots that you had to go into raid for. They still have the chance to get high level Azerite gear from their weekly chest, but even if they do, it's just a bonus because it will never be their BIS piece, because that's just a raid thing. And it might sound to you like I'm saying that only raiders should have access to the best gear, but that's kind of how WoW has always worked, isn't it? Mythic Plus has already leveled that field much more than it ever was before. That's why you only get tier sets and traditionally the best trinkets in raid, and that's fine. That's good, as long as the gear you can get from Mythic Plus is good enough. And I have now talked about this enough to make it confusing, so let me make it super simple again. The 3 very easy changes to fix Azerite gear. 1. 3 spec-specific traits on the outer ring. 2 for Demon Hunters, 4 for Druid, that change automatically with your spec. Lose the neutral trait, just like tier sets. 2. Make the undisputed best-in-slot Azerite pieces for each spec only available in raid. This not only means people aren't frustrated by Azerite stuff being hard to farm in Mythic Plus, it also largely solves the problem of having to work to unlock the exact same traits. 3. Have decent non-Azerite helms, shoulders, and chests on dungeon loot tables that can be obtained like normal dungeon loot. They will never be as good as Azerite Armor of the same item level because they don't have cool traits on them, just like tier sets, but it means players who only run M+ don't have a soft cap on their item level. And that's it. Obviously, all of this is dependent on Blizzard actually being willing to make traits which are interesting, unique, and impactful enough to be worthy of being BIS raid pieces, but they have already promised that's their plan. And judging by the latest blue post on the subject, I am at least slightly confident that they know they need better traits, even though that doesn't really mean too much until we see some of the traits, because yes, we are back to that blue post, the one that came out mere hours ago as I record this vocal. Did you guess what I think of these fixes? Did all my talk of being careful not to treat the symptom of the problem problem rather than the core of the problem itself give you any hints? Did you win the game? Well, the talk of new traits is the sort of stuff they've said before, but I am heartened by the bit where they clarify spec-specific traits, which are typically the most engaging and gameplay changing, will be by default the most powerful ones rather than the general traits, as is the case now. I think you know that I think that's totally how the design behind the traits should be. The idea about having Azerite gear from emissaries scale to 370 I think makes sense. Remember, your newly dinged 120 isn't going to be getting that 370 item level on them. You'll probably need to be at least 360 already for it to scale that high, and honestly, that's just a sensible progression of the system already in place. And it's a nice touch, but it's a classic case of treating a symptom. Takes some of the edge off Azerite acquisition, but doesn't do much to actually solve the real problem, as I think we've covered pretty in depth at this point. The extra ring though, which trait-wise is a second outer ring. Okay, whereas I will definitely enjoy having an extra ring of abilities to play with, I think in terms of actually fixing the problem, this might be their worst idea yet. It's kind of like giving a freezing guy some delicious ice cream. No one is ever going to say no to delicious ice cream, but it would probably be better in the long run to give him a sweater, you know? Oh, maybe one from our new range that is now available in EU and US stores. Just don't get any ice cream down it, okay, mate? It's new. Because Blizzard say that having 2 outer rings will increase the chances of a piece of gear having the trait that you want, which is, it's half true, isn't it? Because in reality, what it means is now your BIS gear has to have the trait you want on 2 outer rings rather than just 1. This has potential to make those players who want the best possible gear they can get, i.e. the top level players, i.e. the ones that are actually most affected by the problems as they exist, even more frustrated with the system than they are now. For me, this doesn't really solve the problem. Blizzard still need to make sure that those best pieces are only available in Raid, and at a pinch emissaries, because if your BIS gear with your BIS traits on both of those outer rings is only available in dungeons, we have the exact same problem that we have now, and it's going to double the resentment that players feel for having to take their chances trying to farm that gear from a Mythic Plus system which clearly isn't designed to be farmed that way, which is another thing this latest blue post proves. Basically what I'm saying is these new changes improve the system in small ways. Excellent. They don't fix it like my ideas do. Yes, that's right. I'm saying my ideas are better, but then I would. And that being said, I'm not a game dev, and the game devs that came up with these changes are game devs. So now I've had my say, I'm happy to wait and see how BfA Season 2, as they're calling it, pans out. And with that, it's over to you. What do you think of my appraisal of the problems with Azerite Armor, and does my fix work? I mean, obviously it does, but that doesn't mean I won't happily listen to your opinion about it as well. Let us know in the comments below. And thanks for joining us today. If you enjoyed this video, don't thank us, thank our patrons who give their actual real-life money to make these videos happen. Without you guys, there would not be nearly as many T&E videos to watch, so thank you. If you didn't like it, downvote the shit out of it. Remember, my name is Chaos Bug. No, my name is Taliesin from me and Evitel. Until next time, cheerio. Oh, wait, buy our new merch. We've got separate US and EU stores now and everything. Okay, cheerio.